Hi, everyone. Welcome to Coronavirus Week 2 World History. Today, we're going to talk about the Japanese side and the Pacific theater of World War II. And to start us off here first,
I need everybody to look at the Google Doc. I'm going to politely ask whoever is blasting their music to turn it off. This is my one and only warning. You are being incredibly disruptive and disrespectful to not only myself, but to your peers. Guys, just because we're not in a physical classroom and we're on a virtual platform doesn't mean that our normal classroom's rules don't apply. So to whoever was playing that music, if I catch you again, you will be in big trouble. So as I was saying before I was rudely interrupted, the Google Doc so I'm going to need everybody to
okay, so the last time we left off, we essentially were talking about Pearl Harbor and how the Japanese had snuck in a secret attack on Pearl Harbor. The key thing here is that this is where our entire Pacific Naval Fleet is. And included in that, I want to just point out that the aircraft carriers that become so important in World War II are not going to be stationed or in the harbor itself, but we did have almost every single one of our battleships, and you can see them lined up. They are named after states like Nevada, West Virginia, Arizona is right here. Okay, and at 7:55 a.m., December 7th, 1941, the Japanese came in and attacked. All right, let's go and let's talk a little bit first about how we became not friends with Japan when we started out as friends in World War I.
But just a few decades earlier, Japan and the United States were allies in World War I. So how did things get so bad between them? It all comes down to oil. To explain, we need to go all the way back to the 19th century. Once an isolated nation, Japan underwent a makeover of sorts to compete with the West. Known as the Meiji Restoration, it embraced industrialization, built up its military, and restored Japan's emperor as the powerful head of state. Aided by two successful wars, Japan aggressively expanded its empire.
Okay, so we talked about this earlier in the class. We talked about the Meiji regime and how the Meiji regime had come back to power and they were modernizing.
The Japanese were becoming an imperial superpower until the Great Depression hit. You see, Japan is an island nation with few natural resources, so it depends on international trade to keep its economy afloat. The economic crisis put a stop to all that. Japan was in a bind, so its military leaders, who called the shots at this point, decided the best defense against financial ruin would be a good offense. They would invade nearby China, particularly Manchuria, for its plentiful resources like iron, soybeans, and land. Lots and lots of unsettled land. So what does this all have to do with the United States? Well, the U.S. was a long-standing Chinese ally, and it watched uneasily from the sidelines as the two nations clashed in the 1930s. But America wanted nothing to do with another war, so it just denounced Japan's aggression. Tensions rose in 1937 when Japan invaded the Chinese city of Nanjing. In doing so, they attacked an American gunboat, killing 3 and wounding dozens. Disturbing images coming out of war-torn China further swayed American opinion against Japan. In response, America attacked Japan's resources. They imposed economic sanctions of aircraft, scrap metal, and other items crucial to Japan's military. The U.S. hoped the sanctions would stop Japanese expansion, but Japan doubled down, invading French Indochina in 1940 and then teaming up with Germany and Italy. Why those two countries? Because like Japan, they were controlled by militaristic governments, obsessed with conquest and driven by a deep sense of nationalism. The final straw came in July of 1941, when President Franklin D. Roosevelt announced a trade embargo on oil. An oil shortage was an absolute disaster for Japan, who relied on imports for 90% of its supply. Not only would this destroy the Japanese economy, but it would put its military at a literal standstill, which meant no more expansion. Japan resented the US for meddling in its quest to dominate Asia. The only solution left for the Japanese was total war. Crush the US fleet in the Pacific and then occupy Southeast Asia and claim its resources. And so, on December 7th, 1941, Japan launched its surprise attack at Pearl Harbor. At first, it seemed like a win for the Japanese, destroying or damaging 21 US ships and more than 300 aircraft, and killing around 2,400 soldiers, sailors, airmen, and civilians. But the success was short-lived. The United States declared war on Japan on December 8th, 1941. Not long after, the Japanese would realize the mistake it made at Pearl Harbor. Their bombers had failed to deliver a mortal blow to the Pacific Fleet, missing oil tanks, ammunition sites, repair facilities, and aircraft carriers. Just 6 months later, remnants of the U.S. fleet would score a key victory against Japan at the Battle of Midway, turning the tide of the war against the once mighty Japanese.
Essentially the United States into World War II. Mastermind behind this is a guy named Yamamoto. And Yamamoto is actually going to be sought by the United States and actually a little bit assassinated towards the end of the war. He's actually going to be, they're going to figure out what he's on a plane and they're going to shoot him down. All right, so he's the mastermind behind this. So I got a couple of pictures. This is Pearl Harbor from the cockpit of a Japanese pilot. Took this picture. You can see down here, these are our battleships that are just lined up like sitting ducks. And again, the key thing to this is that our aircraft carriers were not in the harbor at the time. They were out to sea. That's another picture. Okay, so on December 8th, when Franklin D. Roosevelt actually declares war, he has a famous line and he calls it a date which will live in infamy. Now, I don't know if you know the difference between infamy and famous, or infamous and famous, but infamy means you're famous for something terrible and horrible. So that's what that is. And here is Roosevelt signing the Declaration of War. And of course, the key thing about this is that the United States really puts its entire power behind restoring all of these ships. And within a couple months, half a year, most of them are repaired and put back out to sea. The one that was not repairable is the USS Arizona, which sinks. And today it's a memorial that I'm sure some of you have actually gone to see. There it is right there in Pearl Harbor itself. I've never actually been to it, but apparently it's supposed to be pretty amazing. So 2,887 Americans died at Pearl Harbor. Okay, so let's go through here and let's talk about our Pacific Theater of Operations. This red line is as far as Japanese controlled, okay? And I want you to notice that they go down here into French Indochina, okay? What we call Southeast Asia down in here, the Dutch East Indies into New Guinea. And if you notice also, we've got major battles on all of these little stars. We're going to talk about Coral Sea today. We'll talk about Guadalcanal today, okay? And then we're going to have major offenses, okay? Which of course, the key thing here is that we want to get to Japan. All these other islands are just, there, but we really want to make sure that we can get to Japan in the end of this. And the other thing that we need to point out here is we have a change in naval warfare. After Pearl Harbor, mainly the United States, we have aircraft carriers. And this is going to force the United States to use airplanes and aircraft carriers in naval battles rather than battleships. All right. And this means that you're going to be fighting an enemy that you're not necessarily going to be seeing. You're going to send out your airplanes to get them, and they will send out their airplanes to get you. All right. So Tokyo Rose. Well, an interesting part of the Japanese is that they actually had an English-speaking radio star that the men nicknamed Tokyo Rose. And she would play American music that they loved. And when it's the only radio you have, you listen to her. But she was also full of Japanese propaganda, telling the Americans they were going to lose and that they need to give up. After the war, obviously, all the men wanted to know what this girl actually looked at. We'll talk about, okay, so at the same time as Pearl Harbor, Japan attacked a number of different islands and areas around Asia, okay? They attacked Hong Kong, which was a British colony, Guam and Wake Island, and they also go into Thailand. Okay, so the first part of this war is going to be a disaster for the Allies. Singapore surrendered in 1942. Singapore, by the way, was a British area. The United States, we surrendered the Philippines, which was a U.S. owned territory in March 1942. All right. And for the most part, Japanese were incredibly cruel to the Allied prisoners of war. And the worst thing, and one of the things that they're going to go down for war crimes later on is what's known as the Bataan Death March on the Bataan Peninsula, in which 70,000 prisoners are going to be marched 50 miles, and a lot of them end up dying. So I have some pictures there. You notice that they're carrying their comrades. All right, blazing heat. They have so in the Japanese culture, you were seen as being shameful, okay, if you surrendered. So all of these men, they didn't have respect for them because they had surrendered rather than fighting to the death, which is what the Japanese wanted them to do. So look at this POW report. I was questioned by a Japanese officer who found out that I had been in a Philippine scout battalion. The Japanese hated scouts. Anyways, they took me outside and I was forced to watch as they buried 6 of my scouts alive. They made the men dig their graves and then had them kneel down in a pit. The guards hit them over the head with shovels to stun them and piled earth on top. Now, that's straight out of the textbook there. Okay. All right. So here are some British soldiers. So this guy right here, here is a picture of him after the war. Okay. And you can see that he's essentially been starved to death in the middle of all this as it goes on. Okay. So Japanese victories. 1942 is really marked by Japanese victories. All right. So they went to the Philippines. They went to Malaysia. They go into the Dutch areas, the Dutch East Indies. Okay, they want to, Indonesia, what we would call Indonesia today, is also part of this. And they're successful in every area that they end up going to. Burma and over to India, which is the largest of Great Britain colony. They never really take India. So I want to point out that Japan's a very, very small group of islands, and they started to run out of manpower, okay? So you know that a lot of this was for resources initially, and I know that in our class, and I know in Mr. Mishu's class, they talked about Korea and Manchuria, they needed resources, okay? And that's going to be so much of this. So they're taking over this greater Pacific Empire is what they're calling it. All right, here's Burma. Okay, so at some point, by the time they conquered Burma, they had seized about 1 million square miles, and it's about a quarter of the size of the United States. They had conquered 150 million people, but their force is really cruel. And so initially what they were saying is that they were liberating Asia for the Asians. But once they got there, they were so brutal to the Asians that lived in these different areas, they were really conquerors. And people figured that out very early on. All right, so let's talk about turning the tide. The Allies are going to turn the tide in 1942 with a couple of things. This first one's really kind of insignificant, and I mean that in the best way. But what we did in 1942 is a guy named Doolittle is going to get in a plane and he's going to make it to Tokyo. And I know you think today, oh, what's the big deal? Well, the big deal is planes don't fly as far in 1942 as they do today. Today, it's not a big deal for a plane to take off in Los Angeles and hit China. I mean, it's normal. But back then, this would have been the very end and the very farthest they could get on a tank of gas. Okay, and this is going to raise American morale. And the other thing is, when you start bombing the enemy, it kind of brings it home. And it made the Japanese realize that they're not invincible and that the United States is probably coming.
Now it can be told. History in the making at the mysterious Shangri-La. Actually, the United States Navy aircraft carrier Hornet steams westward across the Pacific.
It was 77 years ago this week that 80 American servicemen struck the first blow against the Japanese mainland in retaliation for the bombing of Pearl Harbor.
Closer and closer they approach enemy-controlled waters.
16 bombers took off from the deck of the USS Hornet, a first in military history, and bombed targets in Tokyo. The attack, known as the Doolittle Raid, was planned and led by Lieutenant Colonel James Doolittle, who piloted the lead bomber. In the co-pilot seat was Dick Cole. Cole, who died this week at the age of 103, was the last surviving member of Doolittle's raiders. In 2014, he told CBS's Anna Werner he signed up for the raid after seeing a message seeking volunteers.
The bulletin board said, does anyone want to sign up for a dangerous mission? And you put your name down.
Yes.
Why would you do that?
There were already no other people's names there. So maybe it was an inspiration.
While Doolittle's raid was not necessarily a tactical success, it did serve a larger goal.
The raid on Japan did very little in terms of physical damage. It did have an enormous psychological impact on the American people.
And for that, Cole and his comrades were awarded the Congressional Gold Medal in 2014, when just 4 of them were still alive. But like so many of the generation that achieved victory in World War II, Cole did not want more recognition than any of the others who risked their lives.
I don't want to take credit for anything, but doing my job.
Good. So Japan no longer feels invincible after this moment. Okay, good. Let's go on with the next slide here, which will be, here we go. Here's Doolittle right here. You can see. Okay, so the Japanese seem unbeatable, but the United States, particularly the United States and Australia, start to want to really strike back. Okay, and we're going to get our first chance at the Battle of Coral Sea, May 7th and 8th, 1942. And I've got all these crazy planes going off all over the place. The truth is that this is a draw. And the worry here, if you notice, is how close the Japanese were getting to Australia. But that we didn't lose the battle was a huge victory, at least in morale and in a lot of ways. So the Battle of Coral Sea, and again, the naval ships themselves don't fire a single shot. It's completely done by airplanes. The Allies suffered a lot more than the Japanese. And however, they do stop the Japanese from moving farther south, especially into the area of Australia. Okay, and last but not least, we've got the Battle of Midway. So Japan decided they wanted to move on to a little island known as Midway. And there was an American airfield there, and it's still there today, by the way, if you were to go over there. This time, once again, the Allies had broken the codes and were aware that the Japanese were coming. The Allies waited until Japan had launched the attack, and then they launched their own, okay? In the end, they're going to destroy 332 Japanese planes, and here's the key. They destroyed all 4 of the Japanese aircraft carriers. And by the way, we call this a turning point in the war. Write that down. This is the turning point. It's led by an admiral named Nimitz, okay? And now from here on out, the Allies are going to be on the offensive. Japan had taken over hundreds of islands across the ocean, but we're going to come up with a plan to get to this, to take care of the problem. The key thing about the problem is that we want to get to Japan. So what we're going to do is one known as island hopping. We're gonna hop onto the islands that are not well defended, okay? And we're gonna skip over the ones that are heavily defended, okay? And that's the key thing to island hopping. Okay, so look at this cartoon. Of course, it's by Dr. Seuss. And it says the Battle of Midway Island. And this is the changing of the tide sick. Well, it seems to be a slight shift in the Japanese current. And if you notice here, that's why we call Midway Island, of course, the turning point. By the way, another thing about a turning point, we don't lose after the turning point. From here on out, we will be on the offensive. And the Japanese will be fighting to keep what they've already taken. Okay. talk about this island hopping. General Douglas MacArthur comes up with it. And by the way, he is, just laid down here, Supreme Commander of the Pacific. He's the guy who directs everybody where they should go. All right. And one of the first places we go to with island hopping is going to be to the island of Guadalcanal. And it's one of the most brutal battles. And it's long. I think it's about 5 months long. But what they wanted to prevent was the Japanese, they found out they were building an airstrip. And they wanted to make sure that they could not get planes that could land and take off on this island. All right. And so that's the end of our lesson for this section. This should keep you going for a few days. And in essence, all I have to say is making these videos is super awkward, but it's all good. All right. If you have any problems, I'll be on, you guys can go on the open discussion and ask questions of Mr. Mishu or I. And that's it for this week. Okay. Bye, everyone.